Good morning and welcome to the Wilson Center Middle East Programs panel on the future of Syria. I'm Marissa Khurma, Director of the Middle East Program. Today's discussion is a very critical one, particularly as the world's attention is focused on Russia's invasion in Ukraine, and in light of how the conflict in Europe affects the Middle East, and especially Syria. Before Ukraine dominated the news, headlines turned to Syria momentarily when in early February, President Biden announced that ISIS leader Abu Ibrahim al-Hashemi al-Qurayshi was killed in a US Special Forces raid in Syria. Qurayshi's death is a critical flashpoint in the resurgence of ISIS and al-Qaeda in the Middle East, particularly in Syria, where the political stalemate and unrelenting violence have generated beyond incalculable internal suffering and a major displacement and humanitarian crisis, regional threats from chemical weapons to Iranian missiles, and the rise of extremist groups. We are truly delighted to be hosting this expert discussion to explore how US and international goals in Syria, from eliminating the Islamic State and removing Iran's strategic weapons to implementing the UN approach to the larger Syrian internal conflict, how it can be achieved, especially in light of current events. I am especially pleased to welcome Dana Stroll, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. Previously, Dana was a fellow at the Washington Institute, and in 2019, she served as co-chair of the bipartisan Syria Study Group, which released its final report on US policy toward the conflict in Syria. Joby Warwick, who is a former public policy fellow at the Wilson Center and national security reporter for the Washington Post. Joby is author of many books, including 3 nonfiction books and a Pulitzer Prize winning Black Flags, The Rise of ISIS, and most recently, Red Line, The Unraveling of Syria and America's Race to Destroy the Most Dangerous Arsenal in the World. And last, but certainly not least, Ala al-Rifai, who is the new Vice President of Field and Constituencies at the National Immigration Forum. Ala was also a Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, working on critical Middle East-related topics. She is a native of Damascus and the co-founder of the independent NGO Syrian American Network for Aid and Development, which helps provide education and support for Syrian refugees. Thank you all for your time this morning. And before I turn this over to Ambassador Jim Jeffrey, Chair of the Middle East Program, a reminder to all of you tuning in today to submit your questions via Twitter at Wilson Center MEP or by email to mep@wilsoncenter.org. Ambassador Jeffrey, over to you.
Thank you, Marissa, and welcome everybody. Thanks for tuning in today, and hello to our fellow guests. This is a very important panel on a very important subject. Arguably, and there is some argument, Syria is right up there with Ukraine and Taiwan as pivot points of the global collective security international rules-based order. Syria has been the one that's been most problematic in terms of combat until Ukraine blew up, but nonetheless, it has its own unique characteristics. If the Middle East since 9/11 or the march into Iraq or the 2000 Camp David Accords, if ever since then the Middle East has been the graveyard of American foreign policy initiatives, Syria has been the Bermuda Triangle of presidential initiatives and decisions from, as Joby reported at length, President Obama's red line to Donald Trump's repeated orders to pull the troops out. The Biden administration so far has downplayed Syria, has not appointed a high-level Syria envoy, and is focusing on the core problems as it sees it, and broadly speaking, they're accurate, which is the huge humanitarian problem. Remember, half the population, 12 million people, are either refugees, 6 million plus, or internally displaced people, and even many of the people who are in the areas that Assad still controls, that half of the population are suffering greatly. And the other, of course, pressing problem we have is the continued resilience of a ISIS pushed out of the cities, pushed away from having a state and an army, but still capable, as we saw in the recent attempted prison break in the Northeast, of launching significant sophisticated attacks, and thus with potential to, if not come back as it did in 2014, certainly become an important threat to the region again. The Biden administration, as I said, is focusing on these two issues. Generally speaking, it is maintaining the various elements of the policies put in place first in the late Obama period by Secretary Kerry, and then the Trump period, maintaining our troop presence in Syria, in the Northeast, and in al-Tanf, various support to the Israelis and their operations against Iran, working with the Turks, trying to get a resolution of the underlying conflict under the relevant 2015 UN Resolution 2254, and working with the OPCW on the outstanding questions on the chemical weapons account with the Syrian government, and finally, bearing in mind that we have responsibility on the future and reintegration into a better Syria of the Northeast, where we have very close allies in the fight against ISIS and Syrian Democratic Forces. So to explore these various problems and where we may be going, it's great to have this panel here today. So what we'll do is we'll turn it over to our three co-speakers for initial comments, and then we'll have a discussion among us, and in the last third, we will turn to questions from the audience. So let's start with you, Dana.
Thanks so much. Good morning to my co-panelists from the Wilson Center. Thanks so much, Marissa and Jim, for the introductions. And thanks for having me today to join you for this really critical topic. What I'd like to do is start my comments by zooming out very large, speaking about the framing documents and strategy recently released by the Department of Defense, then touch on US force presence and posture in the Middle East, and finally share some remarks on Syria policy and specifically the DoD, Department of Defense mission when it comes to Syria. So first of all, some of you might have noted that last week, the department delivered a classified 2022 National Defense Strategy to Congress. At the same time, it delivered the Nuclear Posture Review and the Missile Defense Review, and these were all delivered at the same time, intended to demonstrate linkages between big strategy and how we are going to resource these different efforts going forward. There's a fact sheet available on defense.gov. Let me share the highlights. The NDS, the National Defense Strategy, identified China as the most consequential strategic competitor of the United States. It also said that we will continue, we the United States, to collaborate with NATO allies and partners to reinforce deterrence in the face of Russian aggression. And it said that we will remain capable of managing other persistent threats, including Iran, North Korea, and violent extremist organizations. Finally, it noted that transboundary threats are changing the way we operate, such as pandemic management and climate change. So, for those of you turning into this event, you might be asking yourselves how this list that I just ran through applies to the Middle East or specifically to Syria. If you were paying attention, last year you had a sneak peek when Secretary Austin delivered a speech at the Manama Dialogue in Bahrain, articulating his views for defense engagement in the Middle East. The Secretary underscored that regional security and stability remains a key focus for the Department of Defense, and he emphasized two key messages. First, the strategic imperative of partnerships across the region to address shared threats and shared challenges. And second, he emphasized, reaffirmed, and underscored the US commitment to investing threats in the region, to addressing threats in the region. He made clear that the leading source of instability in the region is Iran. This is due not only to Iran's alarming nuclear advances outside the restraints of the Iran Nuclear Agreement, or JCPOA, but also its continued sponsorship and cultivation of violent proxies and terrorists, its proliferation of increasingly advanced and lethal UAVs, its ballistic missile program, and its maritime aggression at smuggling activities at sea. And of course, US forces specifically who remain present in Northeast Syria to assist in the fight against ISIS through local partners experience on a very regular basis threats from Iran and Iran-backed proxies. During that speech, Secretary Austin also noted that ISIS remains a threat. Though that terrorist organization no longer holds territory in Iraq and Syria, it remains intent on reconstituting and continues to direct and inspire attacks in the region and beyond the region. He reaffirmed US commitment to maintaining our forces in Iraq and Syria in an advise and assist capacity to support partner forces in their fight against ISIS. This, of course, is what the United States does best. We support the development of combat credible forces, we build international coalitions to address shared threats, and we deliver results based on the backbone of military support and contribution of forces and capabilities. He also observed during his Manama Dialogue speech that most of the threats facing the region do not respect borders or boundaries. Here, of course, we have challenges like pandemics and climate change, but also violent extremist organizations like ISIS, Iran-backed terrorist threats, and the networks proliferating UAVs across the region. We're seeing this most acutely, of course, in the Middle East, but this will become a global challenge. Secretary Austin shared his vision for how we will address these threats, organized around the concept of integrated deterrence. This concept is the organizing principle of the National Defense Strategy, the NDS, and when there's an unclassified strategy released, I encourage you all to read it to understand more deeply how the department envisions integrated deterrence and then how it's going to apply to the Middle East. Essentially, it entails combining strengths across the full spectrum of conflict together with all instruments of US national power. So DoD defense capabilities, but also working in a coordinated, concerted fashion with other elements such as the Treasury Department on sanctions, State Department on diplomacy and public messaging, etc. And also bringing to bear our unmatched network of alliances and partnerships. This is going to require combat credible forces, which is why US force presence, security cooperation, security assistance will remain critical in the Middle East, and also an effective nuclear deterrent, which we have prioritized in the administration. So for the department, integrated deterrence is the blueprint for how we are approaching engagement in the Middle East. We are acknowledging that this region is a key theater for competing with China. It's not a pivot, but how we think through competing with China in the Middle East. Second, we as a department are leaning into multilateral security cooperation to effectively deter against Iran and Iran-backed threats, violent extremist organizations like ISIS and al-Qaeda, and other transboundary threats. And third, we support the State Department in implementing proactive diplomacy to reduce tensions and de-escalate ongoing conflicts. We will continue to do this through defense diplomacy, steps to enhance information sharing, actions to develop shared air and missile defense, security cooperation and security assistance, such as military sales, exercises and training, and coalition maintenance. Here again, I should note that there are just tremendous opportunities with Israel coming into the CENTCOM area of responsibility. You saw the diplomatic side of this with Secretary Blinken and all of his counterparts at the Negev summit last week. There's obviously a DoD component as well. As Israel comes into CENTCOM, we can facilitate enhanced air and missile defense, maritime security, et cetera, through exercises, trainings, key leader engagement, et cetera. Ultimately, and over time, as we build these relationships, the United States, through its leadership and relationships, can facilitate effective diplomacy, addressing shared threats, shared challenges, et cetera. And this, of course, can be brought to bear on the series of still brewing conflicts across the Middle East, like Syria, as Ambassador Jeffrey mentioned. Let me zoom in a bit more and focus on force posture in the Middle East. This issue and the questioning of US commitment in the Middle East has been much in the news and on the minds of those invested in the success of this part of the world. So let me be clear. The United States has real combat power in this region, and we are going to maintain it. We have tens of thousands of forces today across the theater at dozens of bases. This does not mean that our force posture will not adjust over time. US force size and mix of forces and capabilities has always fluctuated based on missions in the region, commitments outside of the region, and modernization and readiness priorities at home. You will see that continue to adjust up and down based on requirements. Going forward, we are also looking to transition from static conventional force deployments to more dynamic, agile, and tailored force deployments. Again, this is not about a diminishment of US commitment or investment in the region. It's how we work with partners, bringing to bear our capabilities and our forces, but also how we invest in others. The Global Posture Review concluded last year and reinforced this approach and reaffirmed US commitment to the Middle East. It particularly emphasized that we will maintain our presence in Iraq and Syria to support our partners' efforts to ensure the enduring defeat of ISIS. Okay, let me now zoom in further and talk about Syria policy. As you all know, March marked a full 11 years of untold suffering by the Syrian people at the hands of the Assad regime. The Assad regime's continued pursuit of a military solution to the conflict, enabled by Russia and Iran, has left the Syrian people more vulnerable today than ever before. Syrians today are more hungry, more impoverished, and further away from achieving any measure of political reform than they have been at any point in this conflict. Assad remains intransigent, untouched, and unmoved by the misery around him. In recognition of this reality, the administration's approach to Syria is grounded in several essential priorities: expanding humanitarian access throughout Syria, preserving and maintaining our military presence and partnership with local partners, including the Syrian Democratic Forces, to maintain pressure on ISIS, making clear our ongoing commitment to demand accountability from the Assad regime, supporting basic international norms, promoting human rights and accountability through the imposition of targeted sanctions, and sustaining local ceasefires across the country to keep violence at the lowest level since the outset of the conflict. The US government does not support efforts to rehabilitate Assad, and we do not support others normalizing relations with his regime. We have been clear about this with our partners. We urge states considering engagement with the Assad regime to weigh carefully the horrific atrocities of this regime that this regime has visited on their people over the last decade. We are also not going to lift or waive sanctions, and we do not support the reconstruction of Syria until there is irreversible progress toward a political solution. On the DoD mission, as you all know, the specific authorization for DoD to be in Northeast Syria is to defeat ISIS. Ultimately, the goal for our partners is to be able to independently maintain pressure to prevent ISIS from reconstituting in Iraq and Syria. But the reality is this is not going to be achievable in the short term, which is why we continue to emphasize in every policy and strategy document our commitment to maintaining US force presence in Iraq and in Syria. The January 2022 attack against the detention facility in Hasaka was a reminder that ISIS is a real and potent threat and will require continued pressure and support to our partners as they shoulder the burden of the international community in securing those detainees in those facilities. Here, I do want to commend the SDF for their swift response to the Hasaka attack and convey condolences to the forces who were injured and killed in subsequent operations to return detainees to facilities and to protect local communities from further terror. Also, of course, the February raid noted in the introductory remarks that resulted in the death of ISIS Emir al-Qurayshi demonstrated that DoD is capable of leveraging its capabilities to conduct operations in non-permissive environments. You've heard administration officials say this before. Let me underscore, we reserve the right to use force at a time and place of our choosing. Nobody should question the capabilities of the US military to project power when we think it's in our interest and the interest of our partners and allies. We continue to operate as part of the global coalition to defeat ISIS, which brings together 79 nations and 5 international organizations to provide an array of military capabilities, funding, and political support to the campaign against ISIS. Again, this refers back to in the NDS, allies and partners, defense diplomacy, and what we can bring to bear leading that global network to address shared threats and challenges. Coalition foreign ministers are going to meet in Morocco in May to advance these efforts. You will see the United States continue to invest in multilateral diplomacy to support continued focus and prioritization of resources on these issues and maintaining pressure on ISIS in Iraq and Syria. In the wake of the Hasaka attack, which precipitated increased civilian displacement, as well as SDF casualties and damage the detention facility infrastructure and the surrounding areas, we will, through our network of coalition and our bilateral engagements, emphasize the need to continue supporting local partners and communities through financial contributions to stabilization, humanitarian, and detention facility security efforts. Ultimately, though, that attack underscores what many of us already know, which is that the detention of fighters in Syria is not a long-term solution to this issue. The long-term solution is for countries of origin to repatriate, rehabilitate, reintegrate, and where appropriate, prosecute their nationals out of Northeast Syria, both in detention facilities and to support repatriation of displaced persons who are in camps such as Al-Hol. Finally, let me just speak about spoilers. Jim referenced Russia, Turkey, we spoke about Iran, in Syria, and of course in Northeast Syria. From a DoD perspective, as I look at different activities and actions of Russians, unsafe, unprofessional actions of the Russian military, very well reported Turkish actions in Northeast Syria, and of course continued Assad and Iranian pressure on our partners in Northeast Syria. The question is, are these introducing risk to US forces and risk to mission by undermining the support of our local partners in their communities, or further enabling the destabilization of these communities? This is an area where we, of course, from a DoD perspective, have to be incredibly careful with deconfliction channels and making it very clear that our focus is on defeat ISIS and nothing else. It is also striking to me across the region, the engagement we're having with our partners about Russian aggression in Ukraine, because of course, as we look at the continued brutal imagery and reports coming out of Ukraine, those in the Middle East and those displaced by the violence in Syria know all too well what prolonged and sustained Russian support for an aggressor looks like in Syria. We know what the reports are going to look like. We know what the war crimes and atrocities are going to be reported on, and we know what it looks like for the international community to not stand together and demand accountability for those actions. It seems to me incredibly important that those in the Middle East committed to a rules-based international order from which we have all benefited. Now is the time to stand up and condemn Russian action in Ukraine, and also to note the model of what integrated deterrence in the Europe theater looks like. This is what we are building in the Middle East as well. Now is the time to not stay in the gray space. Note that this is a black and white situation when it comes to Russian aggression in Ukraine. And again, when it comes to displaced persons, when it comes to war crimes and atrocities, we have seen this before since 2015, when Russia decided to back Assad in Syria. And now, of course, is the time to stand together, not only in demanding accountability and pushing back across information operations, humanitarian aid, punishing sanctions in the Ukraine context, but to reaffirm our commitment to not letting Assad's atrocities in Syria stand. Thank you. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dana. We're going to come back to questions in a second. I would just like to say, as you can imagine, as somebody who spent almost 2.5 years working on Syria daily, I much appreciate your layout. In my talks with people in the region, including last weekend in Doha, there's no question on anyone's mind among our partners and allies of where DoD stands, be it Secretary Austin's Bahrain speech, be it the just released CENTCOM posture statement, and certainly what you said today. It's superb, and it's backed up, as you said, by facts on the ground, basically force presence on the ground. All I would say generally is the more the rest of the administration could take the very clear, very high level, strong comments that you made on DoD's policy towards Iran in the region and the comprehensive approach to Syria, which had about 3 DoD elements and about 9 political elements, the happier we would all be. But now over to Joby.
Thank you very much. Hope you can hear me okay. Good to be with you, and it's always a pleasure to share the stage with my excellent Wilson Center colleagues, and I appreciate the thoughtful remarks from Dana and from and the ones to come from Ambassador Jeffrey and others. So my task today is to give a real quick overview, snapshot of where the Islamic State appears to be right now in Syria particularly, and from there try to extrapolate a bit on its plans and where the group appears to be heading. I didn't bring a crystal ball, so this is always a fraught assignment. I did bring a few slides, which I'll go ahead and share. Hang on one second. Okay, hope you can see that. Okay, so it's been quite a year for the Islamic State already. It had the markings of being a breakout year, and I think the leadership saw it that way, but things didn't quite pan out completely as they had hoped. And I hate to be a guy who uses overworked phrases like inflection point, but it happens to be exactly where we are right now. So I'll say it, we're at an inflection point with regard to the Islamic State. For reasons we've all seen, this is a year when ISIS tried to go big with a massive attempted prison break at Hasaka, as has been discussed earlier. This was the most ambitious and most elaborate operation we've seen from the Islamic State anywhere since at least 2017. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And of course, it was also a year of great setbacks, most notably the loss of the Caliph. Abu Ibrahim al-Qurayshi was the second Caliph to be killed in 3.5 years, and he met with almost precisely the same fate as his predecessor, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. He blew himself up with his family to avoid being captured by US Special Forces operators. Now, the raid revealed several interesting things about ISIS, including the fact that both leaders felt safe hiding out in northwestern Syria in an area controlled by HTS, Tahrir al-Sham. And Quraysh's safe house turns out to be just a few miles from the hideout where Baghdadi met his end in 2019. The US operation was an intelligence bonanza, and we're starting to see revelations from that, some of which challenge the conventional wisdom. There's a lot we still don't know, obviously, but we're able to draw a few conclusions. Among them, the fact that Qurayshi and ISIS obviously exercise very good operational security. Qurayshi was an extreme recluse by design, even more than his predecessor. He never appeared publicly, even in video. And yet he seems to have been very much in command of his organization. He was active in operations and planning, much more than Baghdadi was. And though he was in hiding, he was ambitious. He had big plans for ISIS locally and globally. And also, despite his isolation, he was in regular communication with some of his lieutenants, certainly in Iraq and Syria, and also to some degree to some of ISIS's far-flung affiliates in Africa and Afghanistan and other places. We, of course, now know that ISIS has a new caliph. They've just announced it in the last couple of weeks. We don't know a lot about the new guy, who's also a Qurayshi, Abu al-Hassan. But the evidence so far suggests that the Islamic State is sticking with the formula. There are conflicting reports about the real identity of this new caliph, but we know from the official announcement, at least, that he comes from the Islamic State's founding generation, which is to say from the pre-caliphate days when the group was known as al-Qaeda in Iraq and was headed by Abu Musab al-Sarkawi. All the reporting so far suggests that the new guy is Iraqi. It might even be one of Baghdadi's brothers, according to accounts coming from Iraqi officials. And there hasn't been authoritative confirmation of that, but it certainly has a ring of truth. Because of his pedigree, it's safe to assume the Islamic State will continue on the same track as before, with some of the same trend lines we saw under Abu Ibrahim continuing. And so let's look real quickly at what some of those trends are. First, we see a pretty low operational tempo in Iraq and Syria. This has been the case for several years. There's this low sort of background noise of small-scale attacks against Syrian, Kurdish checkpoints, patrols, local and tribal leaders. Institutionally, we see ISIS more inclined to emphasize the activities of some of the regional branches, particularly in Africa and West Africa specifically, but also in the last few months in Afghanistan. ISIS-K is a branch that's fighting the Taliban and with some success, or at least generating some notoriety. And so ISIS feels very much compelled to sort of tweet out or celebrate their successes. And perhaps more significantly, I think, is we see an emergence of a preference for the big splashy event over the small routine kinds of attack, meaning essentially return to ISIS's pre-2019 MO. And we observe this trend from analytical data and also from the group's public messaging. The conflicts analysis firm Extract makes the case that ISIS is saving its energy with the intent of carrying out large-scale attacks, such as the attempted prison break at Hasaka province. That operation started with a car bomb attack, followed by hostage taking and a sustained assault that involved scores of operatives and continued for a week. Now, US officials are pretty consistent in saying the prison break was not very successful tactically. It certainly carried a heavy cost for ISIS with the death of many of its assaulting forces. And it managed to free at least, as far as we know, only a small handful of prisoners. But it also allowed ISIS to portray itself as powerful, capable, and relevant. And ISIS has sought to squeeze every drop of propaganda value from the operation. It's telling that ISIS's announcement of the new Caliph a few weeks ago specifically emphasized prison breaks, suggesting that these are very important and these operations might be continuing to be in the offing in the coming weeks and months. So what do we expect from here? Briefly, I think we can see more evidence of the preference for flashy in the terrorist attacks we saw in Israel in the last 3 weeks. This really is the first look we've had at the thinking of the new leadership. Now, operationally, these attacks in Israel were not particularly sophisticated. We don't know whether they were centrally planned or coordinated out of ISIS in Syria, but ISIS has gone to great lengths to exploit their propaganda value. Obviously, they see value in claiming credit for an attack inside the Jewish homeland, and they're promoting it very heavily for recruiting purposes. So it's more evidence of ISIS's continued focus on high-profile attacks, even if they're carried out by lone wolves, and I expect we'll see more of those, and perhaps more prison breaks as well, because ISIS has called for those specifically and because prison breaks figure very prominently in the group's history and lore. And finally, there's really nothing splashier from a terrorism standpoint than a WMD attack. And counterterrorism officials that we talk to remain very concerned about the possibility that ISIS may attempt to use a chemical weapon specifically. And that's not just speculation, because chemical weapons are very much part of the Islamic State's playbook. And one of the most significant ISIS-directed foreign operations in recent years, in my view, was the attempt to carry out a pair of attacks in Australia in 2017. These involved a pair of Lebanese immigrant brothers who were specifically recruited, and they were tasked with a specific plan that involved 2 different bombings. One of the bombs was a hydrogen sulfide device, a device that was intended to release a chemical weapon. It was a serious plot that was thwarted only at the very late stages and was quite dangerous. And I describe it a bit in my book, Red Line. But we also see, a institutional interest in these kinds of attacks that go back really years earlier. And I actually have some new material in the paperback edition of my book, which sheds light on the Islamic State's very deliberate, very organized efforts to develop chemical weapons under the Caliphate. And the most serious effort was the result of a man that I describe in some detail, whose name was Abu Malik. He was a chemical engineer, and he also was a retired Iraqi brigadier general who worked inside Saddam Hussein's chemical weapons establishment and had real-world practical experience in making chemical weapons. And this is the man that Baghdadi personally recruited and put in charge of making chemical weapons for the Islamic State. He was killed in a military operation, and yet somewhere within the group exists a reservoir of knowledge and experience in making chemical weapons from people like Abu Malik and other technical experts who were recruited to be part of this. So the organization's current goal, if it is to conduct fewer and maybe more sensational terrorist attacks, this is certainly an option that would be very much in their playbook and something within the realm of possibility for this group. And I've gone past my limit. I appreciate your time and attention and look forward to the discussion later.
Thank you very much. Let's turn to Oila now.
Okay, thank you everyone. Thanks for the Wilson Center for having me today. It's an honor to be on this panel and speak to speak to everybody about Syria. I'm gonna speak from the heart today. I'm not gonna speak from notes I've taken and written on pieces of paper, and so I'm gonna speak from my heart as a Syrian, as an American as well. While we are in DC, we have the luxury to envision a future for Syria. While we hear, government officials saying, preaching regional security and stability, the reality on the ground in Syria is completely different. 90% of Syrians live in poverty today. 60% of Syrians, at least 60% of Syrians are food insecure. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people are continuing to face bombing and, Assad attacks on their homes and on their communities. Millions and millions and millions of Syrians are displaced estimate numbers, the estimated numbers are half of the Syrian population, and that's just official numbers. So imagine it's actually worse than that. So there are more than 9 million internally displaced Syrians. There are probably close to another 10 million Syrians displaced in refugees in Turkey, in Jordan, in Lebanon, and in countries around the world. As we see the Ukrainian crisis happening and the recurrent refugees going into Poland and other neighboring countries, the Syrians have already, been going through similar experiences like that. But unfortunately, after 11 years of conflict, the world forgot about the country, forgot about Syria. And now it's being just mentioned because Russia has done horrible things in Syria that it's repeating in Ukraine. And no one really cares anymore. Yes, we want regional stability, we want security, we work with our partners, we want to defeat ISIS. We always hear that defeating ISIS is the only and nothing else, the only mission and nothing else that DOD has or other, departments in the US government has. That's the only vision that they see. And it's been very clear since the beginning of the conflict, since the Obama administration, during the Trump administration, and now during the Biden administration. We have not seen any concrete actions on the ground that helped the Syrian people, period. That has not really been done. Yes, I am going to acknowledge the humanitarian assistance to Syrians, but in the reality, like if we look today, like if we have 90% of Syrians living in poverty and 60% food insecure, have we accomplished what we have been preaching about? No. I'm going to also mention another element that's very important. For Syrians, for myself, and for others, Syria today is a colony for Russia and Iran. Why did that happen? It's because of the inaction of the West, the inaction of the United States, the inactions of our allies and partners in the Middle East. Syria, the Assad regime Assad is just a puppet. Assad is not a decision maker. Russia runs the show, the Iranians run the show. I've written about the Iranian influence and soft power in a study published by the Washington Institute last year. I encourage everyone to read it, to understand exactly what Iran is doing in Syria when it comes to the economy, to the education sector, to social services, and so forth. What we saw recently is also the Biden administration is easing sanctions on the Assad regime and allowing Russian oil companies to exist in Northeast Syria, to operate in areas where our partners exist, the SDF. The Russians are now not only going to invest and use those as resources and oil feeds to expand their power, but they're also encouraging their families to come and live and settle. So we know that the West and the military base in Tartus is controlled by the Russians. The Russians have had for decades a strong presence there, and now they're going to gradually expand in the Northeast and in the eastern part of the country. While at the same time, the Iranians for the past decade at least have been building their networks on the ground, have been resettling their families, that have been using their Shia militias to fight locals and kick them outside of their homes. Ethnic cleansing has been happening. Nothing has stopped. This is all happening, and everyone have access to all of this information, and everyone knows the reality on the ground. But we sit here in DC and preach about regional security and stability. This is the lives of Syrians. This is the lives of people who have been, experiencing this dictatorship of over 50 years. And we see now today that Russia has the upper hand when it comes to negotiations and then in the international arena. And Iran they are strongly backing the Assad regime. And the story continues at the expense of the lives of millions of Syrians and children who are left left with nothing, basically. So I'm going to stop here, and I welcome questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Orla. A comment/question will begin with you, and then I'll go back to the other participants. Slight pushback, although I'm being very careful because I totally sympathize with you and with the Syrian people on everything you've said. Nonetheless, Dana Stroll said something very important, which is, and this administration mentions it from time to time, but it is important, and that is the local ceasefires around Syria. These ceasefires have been in place since 2018. Under the Trump administration, they're supported by the Biden administration, and in effect, they have blocked Assad from taking more terrain since 2018, and they have not completely, but largely ended major fighting in the country. That is a success. Now, I won't get into the details, and it's somewhat unfair to put Dana on the spot, but the Department of Defense has to maintain that its troops in Syria are there to fight ISIS, because that's the authorization under which they can conduct combat operations, which they are doing even in a support and advise role there. But nonetheless, the whole of government approach of the United States has had at least a limited success in freezing the conflict. Now, my question is, what more would you recommend the United States do now, Orla, to try to resolve the underlying problem, a set of problems we have in Syria?
Yeah, although there are ceasefires that, sometimes they are successful, sometimes, but most of the time they are not successful. The Assad regime has to go, to be honest, and you cannot now reward Bashar al-Assad by giving him more aid, recovery aid, humanitarian aid through Russia. He's going to weaponize, as always, this humanitarian aid and use it against his people. He's using it to his advantage. So if we're going through, this is completely not the right approach. Fighting ISIS, to some extent, the US has been successful. Okay, ISIS does not control territory today, right? But the ISIS cells exist. We saw what happened recently in Hasaka. They're going to come back. Also, the Assad regime relies on them for his own survival. So I think the way that Syria has been handled and continues to be handled is completely wrong. We are empowering. We say that we don't want to empower Assad, but we are empowering his allies. We're empowering Russia, and we are empowering Iran indirectly. So is this how we're going to handle the Middle East? And Syria is the heart of the Middle East. I don't think this is the right approach. How are you going to contain Putin and his ambitions? He basically controls the country. I think it's too late now to try to say, oh, we want regional security and stability. Probably that would have been correct, in 2013. Before the chemical weapons attacks on Syrians. So yeah.
No, I understand your point. Dana, at various points in the last now almost 11 years, the US has negotiated at various levels or communicated with the Russians, from military deconfliction all the way to the deal on the chemical weapons in 2013, Kerry's talks with Lavrov, which were incessant. Pompeo actually met with Putin on Syria. Where are you with the Russians? Have you noticed a difference, or are you pushing a difference? Is there a difference in either tone of communications or on the ground with Russia because we're cheek to jowl with them in many respects in Syria?
Thanks for that question. So first of all, let me just refer back to something Ula mentioned. I think it's important to be very clear about the current state of US policy and what we're facilitating and what we're not. So the robust US sanctions program against the Assad regime remains fully enforced. We have not waived or lifted any Syria-related sanctions. And in fact, we're working closely with the State Department, the Treasury Department to ensure compliance with that sanctions program. And you all will know from the Syria study report the tremendous endorsement of the Caesar Sanctions Act, which again remains in force. Consistent with counter-ISIS stabilization objectives, the administration does look for opportunities to improve the economic situation in areas outside of regime control in Syria, focused on preventing the reconstitution of extremism. So I think there's nuance in sort of blanket descriptions of what US policy is or is not. I think it's important to note that. I would also note when it comes to Iran, that there has been continued sanctions imposed on Iran for a variety of activities over the course of this administration, and not one sanction related to the maximum pressure campaign has actually been lifted. So in terms of facilitating or empowering Iran in Syria, I would push back on that and make it very clear that in fact, as Jim rightly noted, the DoD mission, we only have authority to be in Syria for a de-ISIS mission. And through that, of course, is support to the Syrian Democratic Forces and others who are capable and willing to work with us on that mission set. Here, of course, I think is a broader question for the Congress, for civil society, and advocates like Ula, which is, it's not just about what DoD can do or not do, it's about why there hasn't been authorization for a broader mission here. And that, of course, cannot be laid exclusively at the feet of the Department of Defense. When it comes to Russia, to answer Jim's question, our military deconfliction channel with Russia remains open. We continue to use it to protect US forces and be very clear about the specific actions and activities we are undertaking in Northeast Syria, which of course are specifically focused on de-ISIS. There's been no change in Russian willingness to increase pressure on Assad, encourage behavior change by the Assad regime, demand any kind of accountability for the Assad regime, demonstrate distance from the Iranians and also backing the Assad regime, etc. Of course, we have interacted with the Russians through the UN Security Council on issues like maintaining cross-border access in order to provide Syrians in need with humanitarian supplies. In terms of engagement with Russians on a broader political process, etc., there's no illusion here that the Russians are now willing to be a cooperative participant in that kind of political process. I also want to agree with Ula. I think a lot of the focus of the world right now is, of course, on Russian aggression in Ukraine. And it is very easy to move away from or forget the years of suffering at the hands of Assad, Iran, and Russia in Syria. But that's why I think those of us that are focused on the Middle East and focused on Middle East policy and what not just the United States can do, but its allies and partners is absolutely critical at this point in time. And specifically in the region at this point in time, there is nothing that the United States can accomplish unilaterally when it comes to a political process or ending the suffering of the Syrian people or facilitating voluntary, dignified return of displaced persons and refugees. That will require collective action, which is why investing in developing our network of alliances and partnerships remains critical.
Thank you, Dan. I would like just to emphasize, if the US sanctions on Iran and Russia and the Assad regime have not prevented, or have not prevented Assad from continuing to do what he's doing against his people, the crimes against humanity and human rights violations, have not deterred Iran from expanding its power, soft power and hard power in the country, then I think we really need to go back to those sanctions that we imposed and assess them and see if they are effective and if they are enough. In my opinion, they are not.
I think that's a very valid point. As the DoD official, I'm not going to get into a discussion about the utility or effectiveness of sanctions. I'm sure you have your dialogue with the Treasury Department and the State Department on that. But look, overall, I think where we are now, and I reflected this in my opening comments, is I agree with you. ISIS is not defeated, which is why, from a DoD perspective, it's important to maintain that presence and continue working with partners to maintain pressure. Again, there's no military solution to the enduring defeat of ISIS. It will have to be helping local communities recover and remain resilient to repel continued ISIS influence. And when it comes to Assad behavior change, Russia, Iran, and Syria, or frankly, malign activities across the region, again, there's not just a DoD or a kinetic solution to these issues, which is why, again, alliances and partnerships remain critical. Whole of government approaches to these problems remain critical, and we'll continue to work at it. But I take your points, Ula. I think they're really important.
Ula, my comment on that would be, you're largely correct. Sanctions are an imperfect tool. It basically gets to what President Biden correctly said from the strategic standpoint with Russia just a few weeks ago in his State of the Union. Russia weaker and the rest of the world stronger. That's how sanctions usually work. It's if you will, it's an imperfect war of attrition to weaken the other side with goal A, getting the other side to change its policies. Sanctions did work, for example, with Iran in 2015 in getting into the JCPOA nuclear agreement. Sanctions did work on Turkey in 2019 in getting Erdogan to agree to a ceasefire and a halt in operations in the Northeast. But that's the exception. Most of the time, essentially, its goal is to weaken the other side and open the door to a possible solution. But sanctions will not get you through that door most of the time, unfortunately. Okay, Joby, question for you. You mentioned ISIS is taking a different model and hasn't done a lot of major operations other than the splashy Hasaka prison attack. But where we see ISIS seemingly mounting the biggest attacks are in the parts of Syria beyond the control of the US and the SDF, Palmyra, the Badia Desert, out to the Iraqi border. How are we going to defeat ISIS if ISIS cannot be defeated in those areas where the US and our partners are not running a fight in Iraq and Northeast Syria?
That's a really good observation, Ambassador. And I've obviously seen this as well, that SDF continues to have successes. They continue to experience attacks, but where ISIS is managing to have a little bit more successes in the regime-held areas. And occasionally we've seen the Russians go after specific targets because they're aware of this problem and they're trying to erode it or degrade it to some extent. But it's a Syrian capability issue as far as I can tell, and there is a lack of capacity, maybe a lack of will. I'm not as sure of that, but there does seem to be some an inability of the Syrians to respond to these threats in an effective way. And this is important because it allows ISIS to continue to grow and the threat to metastasize in those regime-held areas. And so this has to be, if we're looking at long-term solutions, which are way over the horizon to the Syrian crisis, it has to involve an improved Syrian ability to control its security within its borders, within the area that it supposedly governs. And it just hasn't shown much success in doing that in some of these ISIS areas.
Thanks, Joby. Dana, I know you have to leave and you're probably hoping you could escape without another question, but I'm going to direct the same question to you. Tactically, we've been brilliantly successful since 2014 in defeating ISIS as a state, in blocking its threat to essentially governments and overall security and control in both Iraq and Northeast Syria. The situation is different, however, in the rest of Syria. And as we've seen with Joby's discussions of one-off attacks in Israel, possible chemical weapons usage, ISIS does still have an international persona. And from what I know, leaving aside any details, much of that is found in those areas not under our control in Syria. Where do we go in this campaign beyond continuing doing what we're doing right now in Iraq and Syria?
I think it's a really important question. So first of all, let me just reflect very specifically on Iraq and Northeast Syria, which is, again, the answer can't just be DoD support. It can't just be kinetic tools here. There's economic challenges here, recovery challenges, stabilization, et cetera, where people continue to suffer, where people don't have access to political representation, et cetera. Extremist ideologies are going to thrive. So that's number one. Number two, if you follow State Department designation announcements, you'll know that ISIS is actually continuing to inspire branches globally. One was just announced and designated in Brazil a few months ago. So here I think we need to reflect on the infrastructure we've built through coalition to focus on all the different aspects of defeating ISIS in Iraq and Syria. And it wasn't just the DoD military instruments. It's not just training and equipping local partners to fight ISIS. It's also countering terror financing, focusing on ISIS ideology, radicalization, inspiration, and propaganda. It's looking at the flow of terrorist fighters and working with countries of origin on their domestic authorities and legal infrastructure to stop those flows and also repatriate foreign fighters when they are detained or apprehended, et cetera. We're going to need to think through what expanding the lessons learned from our coalition focus on Iraq and Syria looks like globally. Any of Joby probably is looking at and aware of ISIS branches and ISIS-inspired activity in the Sahel and Africa. We can see it in other areas, et cetera, and obviously ISIS-inspired attacks in Israel. This can't just be about kinetic action, but I think there is an architecture for coalition focus on the various aspects of ISIS ideology, inspiration, and how it issues command and control, how it inspires, how it transfers knowledge, et cetera. And we need to work with other partners and governments and communities who are at risk from this and transfer that knowledge and continue to build out the architecture to maintain pressure on this network.
Thanks so much, Dana, and hope to have you back soon.
My pleasure. Thank you all.
Okay, Oyla, one last question to you, and then we'll open it up to the audience. We've seen a number of states, most aggressively the Emiratis, but several others too, reaching out to the Assad regime. As you know, Assad traveled for the first time in many years to another Arab state, to Dubai. What is the message to these Arab states from the Syrian people?
The Syrian people reject any type of normalization with the Assad regime. Basically, that's it. Very simple and very straightforward. Normalization with the Assad regime, meaning crimes are going to continue. It means crimes are going to continue. Human rights violations are going to continue. Displacement is going to continue. The conflict is going to continue. Russian aggression, Iranian aggression is going to continue. And the misery is going to continue. That's the answer from the Syrian people.
Thanks. My perception of where the states are is it's important that that message be made. People will hear the message, but they need to hear it as consistently and as strongly as possible, because from everything I have seen in getting involved in this conflict, the vast majority of the Syrian people would agree with exactly what you said. So thank you very much. Okay, we're going to be moving to questions from the audience now. Okay, here's one for either of you and also for me, I guess. Do you predict the evacuation of Iranian-backed forces, including Hizballah, from Syrian territory anytime soon? I will start with you, Joby.
No, I wish we could start with you on that. I frankly don't see it anywhere soon. I mean, I think what I'm curious to see is how the sort of balance of power changes because of Russia's involvement in Ukraine. I think it's early, but I'm wondering if eventually we'll see some shift in emphasis or shift in military deployments because of the Ukraine situation. Russia has traditionally kept the Iranian ambition in check. has helped the Israelis on that front. I don't see them really ever sort of mustering the will to really force the Russians to leave completely. Just doesn't seem to be, something they see as a priority, and Iranians certainly aren't interested. I think they're just more entrenched now than they've ever been historically. I don't feel very optimistic about that at all.
No, I'm not optimistic either. There's two sets of Iranian problems. One, which Oida and also others have commented on, is Iran's infiltration into Syria, despite the fact that it is working with a friendly government, that of Assad. We see patterns that are not dissimilar to that in Iraq, Lebanon, and Yemen. There seems to be a great deal of Iranian commitment through their proxies and through the Quds Force to continuing this deep into Syrian society. The other thing, of course, which is, as you mentioned, the Israeli campaign, is on long-range missile and related strategic systems. From my own experience dealing with at least the Russians, and indirectly, even at times, the Syrian government, we didn't deal with them, but we had a pretty good idea of what they were thinking. There was some concern as to why, on top of all of the other problems that even the Russian Syrian Assad side had in Syria, the Iranians were introducing another strategic element into it. My own view is because that's what Iran does in the region. Whether you can get a withdrawal of some systems and some capabilities and not all of them, I don't know. But certainly my experience, particularly in Iraq, with the infiltration of groups, militias, political forces, economic actors by Iran is profound, it's professional, and it's persistent, and it's going to be a real problem. Okay. So let me go back to Ulla on that. What are you hearing from people on the ground about Iran's presence? We hear stories in Dar ez-Zor of very close relations between Iran and some of the tribes, possible conversion from Sunni to Shia Islam. Is there any truth to this?
Oh, what's happening on the ground is complicated when it comes to Iranian presence. And I really encourage everyone to read my study that was published at the Washington Institute last year, In the Service of Ideology, Iran's Soft Power in Syria, basically. So conversion, let me just make it as a simple example. If you have no food, no water, no shelter, and you need to provide those for your children, a Shia clerk comes to you and tells you, I'll give you those services, I'll give you those resources, just say that you convert to Shia Islam. What do? If you have to really provide for your children and give them cover from bombing, you have to say, okay, I want to survive. That's what's happening in Syria. That's what's happening in Deir ez-Zor, as you mentioned, and other areas all over the country, not just in Deir ez-Zor. The Iranian presence is very strong all over Syria, northeast and southwest and west to east, everywhere. I have a whole map of their presence in my study. You can go and look into details of their activities on the ground, the economy, the education, the social services, the military. Obviously, everyone knows about the military aspect, but I focus on the soft power. They plan to exist in the country for decades to come. There is no way that they're going to withdraw. They are there. They're part of the social fabric right now. They, forced themselves on the society in so many ways. Yes, Assad has welcomed them. Assad needed them for his survival. And this is, as I said before during my remarks, Syria is a colony for Iran and Russia. It is a colony. That's the reality on the ground.
Thanks. So that gets to the next question. What are Russia's and Iran's main disagreements with the Assad regime, and how will those tensions manifest in the coming years? I think this is very, very important because it is one of the key questions and key issues that will shape how Syria evolves, what happens to the Syrian people. I'll give you my views and then I'll turn it over to both Joby and Oyla. From hundreds of hours of talking with Russians on this, and it's not always certain that they're giving us their real views as opposed to the views they want us to hear. Nonetheless, there is, first of all, a classic 19th century competition between two powers, Russia, a quasi-great power, and Iran, a significant regional power, on influence, on control, on calling the shots. This is very, very critical, for example, and we see this a lot in commercial deals. Who wants to run the ports? Who wants to control strategic elements of the economy? Both Russia and Iran, and it's their militaries to a significant degree, are very involved in these things. Oil in the Northeast, for example, is something they both lust after. And I use the verb deliberately based upon the attention that the Russians directly and the Iranians indirectly have given to that subject. You remember the Wagner attack across the Euphrates, aiming for an oil field back in 2018 was only the most violent manifestation of that. Nonetheless, there is a general difference. Russia, from my standpoint, its project, other than to maintain its basic interests, which it has more than done, its possession of bases and strategic military facilities and a friendly government, aims to use a success in Syria, this is something the Russians emphasized, to undermine the US-led collective security system that, with various bumps and pluses and minuses, has been in effect since the 1973 Yom Kippur War. To do that, Russia needs a successful Syria. It recognizes it doesn't have a successful Syria. As Ula said, most of the population has fled Assad. The Russians, therefore, are very interested. They did back in late 2020 a failed refugee international conference in Damascus to try to promote international support for their and Assad's vision of refugee return. Well, nobody in the international community is willing to buy into that because we know that Assad himself is not interested in refugees returning. He hasn't taken the steps that even the Russians have laid out in terms of changing laws, allowing restitution of property, giving guarantees to both the Syrian people and to UNHCR that are required to promote the return. So that is one area where the two, because in all of these things, Iran seems to be supporting Assad. Assad's goal is to have a nation state with a seat in the UN, with a national flag, I guess a national soccer team, and a national anthem in the rubble of Damascus. He's happy with that. He obviously wants more, but he's not willing to take any step to get more. Iran generally is happy with that as long as he allows Iran to do the things Ula mentioned with Syrian society and the deployment of his long-range missiles to threaten Israel and other countries. Again, Russia does want to see a Syria that perhaps we would not, or the Syrian people would not consider successful, but the region would consider successful. This is why I'm so troubled by the efforts by the Emiratis and certain other Arab countries. They think to push Iran out, that's what they tell us, to make, yeah, I agree with you, to make reach out a hand to Assad, because it starts making the project look like a success. And that's going to only encourage Russia and Iran to try to do the same thing in other countries. But Ula, over to you and then to Joby.
I do agree with you, Ambassador. And the way you describe it is exactly how I see things happening. And yeah, it's a joke. They're trying to normalize the relations, the Emiratis or the Saudis or whoever, normalize the relations with the Syrian, with Assad. Okay, say if we do that, then we can contain Iranian influence. I don't know on which planet they live, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. Okay, next question. Ula, well, Joby, could you respond to that as well?
Just real briefly, I've been struck by some of the sort of practical arrangements that have sprung up between Iranian and Syrian interest, including commercially. It's not just legitimate businesses like cell phones, port operations, but also illicit commodities like narcotics, like Captagon, which has become this booming industry in Syria, supported by elements of the Syrian regime, armed forces, certainly some members of the Assad family, and to some extent, Iranian military units and personnel who've taken a role in the distribution of these drugs. And so we see these extraordinary, seizures of Captagon coming from Syria, sweeping across the Jordanian border, spurring firefights along the border, and in massive quantities of these drugs showing up in Gulf countries and in Europe. And so these kinds of relationships are springing up organically, and they're helping essentially entrench Iran's interest in the region on a personal level, corporate level, as well as on a territorial sort of geopolitical level.
Thanks. And you also just answered the next question, which is drug trafficking in the south into Jordan and the role of the Assad regime. It is aiders and abettors on that. That is, this was just developing as almost a seventh problem, along with the six major international problems that Syria had generated as I was leaving government, but it has loomed large. And there was a major battle along the border between the Jordanian army and these smugglers just 2 months ago. Next question is, what is the state of civil society in Syria? Is there any success of grassroots organizations countering Russia and Iran's soft power? Ula, can you tackle that?
They do exist. They are there. They're outnumbered. They're struggling. They've been targeted. Civil society leaders have been assassinated. One that's very dear to me, Ra'ed Faris, was assassinated a few years ago and killed. But he built a network of people on the ground, and some of them have had no way but to leave. Like they fled, and it's understandable. Civil society has in Syria today has no place to operate or to care for these civil society NGOs and small organizations. They have no space to breathe. That's what I'm trying to say. But if we give them the space to breathe, then we're going to see, a lot of activities like we saw before early days of the revolution. But they are still there. They're still operating on a smaller level. They do push back against Iranian, involvements in their communities. They do push back against Russians. They do push back against the regime's mukhabarat and so forth. But they are very weak. And why they are very weak is because the world neglected them. The US neglected them. Our allies neglected them. And that's the reality that no one wants to hear.
Yeah. They are active, of course, in the areas that Assad does not control in the northwest and the northeast, and they do good work there. But certainly in the regime areas, as you indicated, it's a risky business trying to manage civil society.
Ra'ed Faris was in Idlib. Ra'ed Faris in Kaframbil. He was assassinated in his hometown, and that was Idlib is a region that's under the Free Syrian Army and the different factions on the ground not controlled by Assad himself. So, yeah. Yeah,
of course, everybody operates in Idlib, including ISIS, as we saw earlier, including us, the Turks, Hayat al-Sham, the Free Syrian Army, and unfortunately, Assad. But no, that's very helpful. Joby, anything on the role of the Syrian people in these various issues that you followed so closely, from chemical weapons to Iran to the rise and perhaps fall of ISIS.
Yeah, I just have to say that despite the inability of civil society to really make much of a presence because of obvious restrictions and challenges, there is quite an active network informally within the country on all kinds of issues, including the chemical weapons issue. Some of the best reporting, some of the best real-time information coming out about the attacks, from the early ones in 2012 and 13 to the more recent chlorine attacks. It's been from a very sophisticated, very well-informed, informal network of Syrian doctors, sort of medical experts, white helmets, and others who pass along information and evidence in many cases to the outside world, to the OPCW, to the UN, to some of the Western governments. So that exists. And also just in the, I've been struck just in my work on the investigating the raid that killed al-Qurayshi just a few weeks ago, the importance of informational networks in identifying bad actors, particularly in the Northwest, but in other areas as well. That raid in February was the culmination of months of work by local informants as well as our own professionals in trying to track down this particular individual, collecting information about where he was, about habits of life, trying to minimize civilian casualties. Our DOD and intel agency colleagues certainly worked very hard on this, but there was a great deal of information that came from the Syrian side as well on the individual level, and that can't be underestimated or underemphasized in these kinds of operations.
Yeah, so just to add to what you just said, Joby, yes, it's the Syrians don't give up, basically. They always find a way. They have been fighting this regime for the past 50 years. They don't give up. So even in during hard times, they find ways to stay hopeful, to organize, and as you said, of course, many organizations on the ground have been given credible information about the status of the conflict to the international community, and they continue to do that work. My point was they have been weakened a lot, and they need the support that we should give them. The free world should support them, should give them the space to transition from this misery. But yeah, whatever comes their way, Syrians never lose hope. They really don't.
Thanks. We have just a few minutes left. I'm going to ask two questions to each of you, and then we'll have final statements. First question is, what do you think will happen, given the state of US-Russian relations, when the Security Council has to renew the Northeast Syria humanitarian crossing from Turkey into Idlib, where there are some 3.5 million IDPs? The second question is, the removal of Rami Makhluf, essentially a relative and confidant previously of Assad, and a very important economic figure. What does that say about Syria's economy and financial responsibility? So we'll start with you, Joby.
So I'll address the second one because I'd love to hear Ola's thoughts on the first. But on Makhluf's removal, which is quite extraordinary given his close, very intimate ties with the regime and his importance economically. He's a major, such a one-man powerhouse in terms of Syria's economy. And so I think that what that reflects as much as anything else is just the sort of the state of internal disarray within the regime and its supporters and its functionaries. There's they have struggled to figure out a way to regain their footing. That economically they haven't been able to manage to attract the kind of international economic support they need, and that's why you see them doing things like investing in Captagon and other illegal narcotics. And so Makhluf eventually was on the outs and was pushed out of the Assad's inner circle, and that just reflects sort of the chaos I think that we're seeing at the top right now.
Yeah, it reflects the chaos, but also Bashar needed money from Rami. And Rami he's the biggest, he's the biggest tycoon in the country. He had a lot of money. He needed money. So Bashar and Asma wanted to take over, his businesses and to find ways to finance their operations. So this was but they will never get rid of Rami. I've also written about this topic in the past. We're going to always see these family feuds happening, but Rami is an important player in the Assad regime. They wanted to contain him. They wanted to get his money. They wanted to find ways to control him for their own interests, but they're always going to be operating together in the end. For the other question, was it about Bab al-Hawa? Yeah. So I think in July, that's the deadline when we will see what's going to happen with the Bab al-Hawa crossing. I don't know what's going to happen. I can't say, to be honest. It should be open, honestly, because it's the crossing that provides aid to millions of people. What the Russians are trying to do is to find ways to pressure the US to use other, smaller crossings in the area that would go directly to the regime. They want to empower the regime. They want to channel all the aid directly through the regime. And we know why that's happening. So I'm afraid that the US is going to basically submit to this pressure. And we're going to see more and more famine and hunger because when Assad gets the aid, he weaponizes the aid, as I said before.
Thanks. We'll wrap it up now. I'll start and try to be a bit provocative and then over to the two of you. Dana Stroll accurately presented not only the Biden administration's policy on Syria, but frankly, it was almost word for word what we were trying to do in the Trump administration. If possible, get a deal, and that's of course less likely now because of the state of relations with Russia, but failing that, block Assad from making progress. The problem we have now in assessing the administration, not DOD, because DOD is doing its part of the job quite effectively, but the administration as a whole is how fiercely it is trying to block Assad's step-by-step rehabilitation. We saw this a bit, Ula mentioned, in last summer's compromise on the Bab al-Hawa crossing, where the administration accepted language sort of nodding towards what we call cross-line humanitarian transfers, which means under Assad's control, which means weaponization of it. And we fear that this may happen again, although Russian-Turkish relations will play a role in the Russian decision this summer, and they're very much dependent now on Ukraine, even more than Syria. But still, there is a question of how vigorously the administration is going to resist that pressure. There's always the alternative, although it's very ugly, of getting assistance across from Turkey without a UN mandate. But as I said, it's the less desirable option. And then the other thing is the success. The administration talks the talk on blocking the development of relations with Assad, but we haven't seen countries paying as much attention as they did in the past, and this is troubling. So there is some confusion about where the administration wants to go on Syria beyond trying to push it off the front burner. But Syria, as we all know, keeps on coming back to the front burner because it is a terrible tragedy, and it is a really serious threat to the international community and international security. So over to you, Joby, and then Noila.
Just real quickly, and I know that everybody is really seeing this as well, but for those of us who watched Syria for a very long time, are seeing the same scenes play out in Ukraine, and it's so evocative of the experiences that we've all shared over the last few years. And every atrocity that's being highlighted and discussed by the international press we saw that playbook develop in Syria with a deliberate attacking of medical facilities, of targeting of supply lines, of, refugee, centers. Just it's those strategies and those tactics were developed in Syria, and now we're seeing them play out in a different theater with a much greater outcry, because it's in the heart of Europe and not in the Middle East, which is always interesting to see. But the one thing that we hope won't happen, that the Syrians exploited very well, was the use of chemical weapons. When you have a city that's been reduced to rubble, bombs and bullets have a limited impact. Chemical weapons, even chlorine gas, can be very effective in driving out defenders. And there's a great concern that Russia might resort to those kinds of tactics at some point.
That's a really brilliant set of points you made. I would just like to interject. People who say we care about the Ukrainians because they are, European, and we're mainly European, and the Middle East is Middle East. I don't think so. I think the reason is that we mistakenly thought, well, Syria is an internal conflict. So even though Assad, the Iranians, and the Russians are doing all these terrible things, there's only so much we can do because, heck, it's an internal conflict. Those countries are operating, under the guise of sovereignty. And so we didn't do enough to stop all of this. And now we're seeing they'll simply take it to another level and attack a sovereign country. And they're just going to continue until they are stopped, be it in the Middle East, be it in Europe, be it in Asia. Orla, last word to you.
Yeah, it started as a peaceful uprising against a dictator, peaceful protest that, was all over the country in Syria. They were shot at, they were attacked with tanks, they were killed, children, women, elderly, assassinated, targeted, imprisoned, tortured, starved to death. That's the story of Syria. It was a peaceful uprising, but then it became a regional war and an international Cold War, if I can say, between Russia and the US, a second Cold War, where Russia is trying to take over, and the US has only limited resources, or says that it has only limited resources to intervene. And now Putin used Russia Syria as an experiment. And now he is showing the world that he can do similar things in Ukraine. When is the US going to act and the free world is going to act? Yeah, we are doing sanctions and whatever. Is that preventing the atrocities, the tragedies, the human misery? It's not. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. In response, having dealt with this, it's not a question of limited resources. Our resources and those of our partners and friends who we've mobilized for Syria and for other conflicts, including Ukraine, are extraordinary, unlimited. They have no competition. The question is a possible lack of will. And I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave it at that point. Thank you all for joining us today, and hope to see you all again. Bye-bye.